What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Terminator Training Show. I am Kevin Smith. Today's back to the Q&A edition, Instagram Q&A edition. After a couple of overrated, underrated part 1 and 2s. Hopefully you guys enjoyed those. And we are back to the old faithful question and answer. This is from this week's Instagram stories. If you have questions in the future, follow me on Instagram, Terminator_training. And look out for my usually weekly, sometimes bi-weekly Q&A posts where I ask you guys to ask me questions. I answer them, at least as many as I can get to, on Instagram. And I also choose some of the better ones to go more in depth on here in the show. This week, I'm trying something slightly different. I'm actually still doing it. I am basically the first day I answered a bunch of questions, and then I am going to continue going back into my archived story from that day and answer some more questions throughout the week. Just because I know some people don't get their questions answered, and I get a lot of questions. I just only have so much time to get back to people on their answers. So I figured I would continue to trickle them in. And then, of course, the better ones I will also cover here on the show more in depth and try to get to as many as I possibly can, provide as much information as I can, and give you guys what you're looking for. So appreciate all of the support. Appreciate you guys asking me great questions. And yeah, so I just got back from a 10K run here in North Carolina. We had fake fall, I like to call it fake fall, that occurred last week for about, I would say 8 or 9 days. It was really nice. It was like in the mid 80s and low humidity and beautiful. And now fake fall is over. It's now really hot again and humid again. So I went for a 10K run. Looked like I jumped in the lake afterwards because the dew point, it wasn't crazy hot out yet. It was in the morning, but the dew point was high. It was in the mid 70s. So we're back to it feeling like summer again. It is the 31st of August as I record this. So hopefully real fall is somewhat just around the corner. Who knows? We'll see what happens, but one can always hope. But anyway, let's hop into today's questions. First question, is it smart to put strength/running on maintenance when going on a cutting phase? It does depend. So you definitely don't want to necessarily try and put strength on maintenance, or you don't want to try and put your strength training on maintenance. The main thing when you're going into a cut, if you want to improve your body composition and not just lose weight on the scale, there is a difference. Improving your body composition is what happens when you lose mostly fat and you maintain muscle, or in some cases, rare cases, in a deficit, gain muscle. But for most people, their main goal is to lose body fat and therefore improve their body composition, not necessarily just lose weight. And the best way to do that, because being in a calorie deficit is naturally going to be catabolic, which another word for that is causing muscle loss. The thing that you really want to focus most on is training as if you were trying to gain muscle. So even though you're not going to be eating like you're trying to gain muscle, when you train with that mindset in that approach, you are far more likely to maintain more muscle. Obviously, you can't be in some crazy deficit. You've got to be eating plenty of protein in order to maintain that muscle. I would say in a deficit, at least a gram of protein per pound of body weight. A couple different benefits to that. Obviously, while you may not need technically 1 gram per pound of body weight, you want to be fighting the potential muscle loss effects as much as possible. So why not cover your bases a little more by eating more protein? And an additional benefit to that is it also will help you stay satiated. You're not going to be as hungry when you're eating more protein. So I would say at least a gram of protein per pound of body weight. And I wouldn't necessarily think of putting strength on maintenance. You can absolutely put strength on maintenance if you want, but I would train almost the exact same way that you were training before in the gym. What will most likely happen if you do it right, you don't do anything too extreme, you will most likely at least maintain your strength. You will at least maintain your muscle for a long period of time. Maybe not forever, maybe not for your entire cut. But if you start losing strength and start losing muscle pretty early on in a cut, you probably aren't doing something correctly. You definitely can maintain strength for a while in a cut. Not perpetually, but for a little while. If you start losing it early on, you may be doing something too drastic, or you may be doing what a lot of people do, and they go into a cut and they increase their training volume. They try to burn more calories, which is not a good idea. Even though that sounds kind of like the intuitive approach, it is not a good idea. when you're in a calorie deficit, you're also in a recovery deficit. So when you go into a cut and then you increase training volume or intensity, I would say definitely keep intensity high, but a lot of people's definition of intensity is to just do more and more and more and try to be as fatigued and smoked as possible all the time. Keep your intensity high in regards to how hard you're pushing your sets, but don't try and do like some crazy intensity like Metcons and HIIT and all that kind of crazy stuff all the time in combination with going into a cut. Don't try to increase your cardio. You mentioned cardio as well. I absolutely would consider, unless you have performance goals for cardio, I would consider potentially reducing your cardio a little bit. I know that sounds a little bit off compared to what most people do when they go into a cut, but if your goal is mainly body composition and not necessarily cardio performance, like you're not trying to get really, really good at running or anything like that, you can almost use cardio as like an ace up your sleeve. If you start doing cardio early on, your body's going to adapt to it relatively quickly, and you're going to need more and more and more. You're going to need to eat less and less and less as the cut goes on. So what I would do is reduce the cardio a little bit because you're going to be in a little bit of a recovery deficit. Really focus on strength training. Make sure you're not in a crazy calorie deficit or eating too little protein or anything like that. And really just focus on your strength training and try to gain strength. Even if you don't end up gaining a ton of strength, that should be your mindset towards strength training, because that is going to preserve as much muscle as possible. And that is going to be your best insurance on not losing muscle and fat, or more fat than muscle, which happens to a lot of people when they try and go the calorie burn route. Using your training as a means of losing weight, body fat, whatever it may be, is not a very sustainable approach. It can be a good short-term approach. That's why I considered cardio to be more of an ace up your sleeve. Cardio can be implemented for short periods of time, especially when you're not adapted to it. Your body is not super efficient at it. Being efficient at cardio is great for performance. That is what you want. But if you're using cardio to augment weight loss or augment fat loss and improvements in body composition, you don't want to be efficient at it. The more calories you burn doing that cardio, the better in that case. So if you kind of save it for when you need it, when things slow down, or when you don't want to drop any more food, and you think that, adding a few days a week of incline walking or something like that into your routine would be a more realistic and more practical option than just further cutting your calories, that can be a great thing. But the optimal, in my opinion and in my experience, the best fitness approach for going into a cut, the best thing to do with your training is to focus on strength training, try and progress. Even if you don't progress, that should be your goal. Expect to not lose anything for a little while, but still train as if you are trying to gain muscle, because that's your best bet on maintaining it. And just walk for your activity. You absolutely can do a little bit of cardio for health, but just remember that you are not going to be recovering as well from your training. And if you try and throw in more cardio, or if you try and just do it just as much cardio right off the bat, you're not going to have that ace up your sleeve, because there is a limit to what the body can handle in regards to cardio. And just doing more and more cardio, that might be a lot of people's first thought when they start hitting that plateau. I'm going to do cardio early, and when I hit the plateau, I'm just going to do more. Well, guess what? Being in a deficit is also a stressor. It increases your stress hormones. It is a significant stressor on the body. The body doesn't want to be in a deficit for a very prolonged period of time. And additionally, doing cardio in that environment is also a stressor. So it's just going to increase your stress levels, and you're not going to feel great. You might lose weight on the scale, but most likely it's not going to be the type of weight you want, and you're going to feel terrible, and it's not sustainable. So definitely did not directly answer that question. It does depend on lots of different things and what your goals are. But if your main goal is body composition, I would take that route. If your main goal is performance, you probably want to at least continue to try and progress on your conditioning and your strength and stuff like that. But it really just depends on what you're going for and how long you're going to be in the diet and multiple different other factors. But those are hopefully some things you can consider as you approach it, and hopefully that helps you kind of develop the idea of it. Next question: in the 2 mile and 5 mile, can we do the weight training on the program paired with the base building? Yes. For those not aware, I have a 2 and 5 mile run program. And on that program, at the beginning, if you don't have a base build, if you haven't been running, I suggest following the base building portion that is in the intro of the program. And yes, absolutely, you can for sure implement the weight training sessions as you do the base phase. I believe it's written in there in the intro, but the intro is relatively long, and I like to cover everything fully knowing that most people aren't going to read the entire intro. It's more like an ebook than a program, which is why it takes me a long time to build programs, because I like to cover all the bases. And I think it says that in there, that you can definitely do the weight training along with the base phase. But even if it doesn't, I'm telling you right now, you absolutely can. I would just do phase one of the weight training. You could do honestly any phases of the weight training. The weight training is literally in there just to support the running. It's not necessarily progressing on itself like maybe Jack Gazelle would be. So you can honestly start with any phase of the weight training and then just do the running on the side. And then once your base is built, you can start with phase one. That would be my recommended approach. And that is totally fine and honestly suggested. I would either do that, or if you have a reasonable program to follow on the side, you can do that type of strength training program. When you're building a base, the lifting that you do is a little bit less important. You can pretty much follow any lifting program and build a base at the same time. There are definitely caveats to that. There are exceptions to that, but it's not quite as important as when you're actually going through the program. Like in phase one, you want to follow the lift program just kind of to a T. And also on that note, if you are actually following the running portion of the program, I suggest not adding a different program for lifting at the same time. I've talked about this before, but it's still worth reiterating and re-mentioning, because I know people probably are already doing that, or people may be wondering whether they should do that or not. But the lifting is very intentional, and it is put in there in a way that should not interfere much with the running. And if anything, it should support the running. So good question. Next question, can low T affect metabolism? And if so, how much? Yes, it absolutely can. Let me cover the last bit really quick. How much? Way too complicated and way too nuanced to give you a decent idea. It's almost impossible to quantify just how much it's going to affect metabolism. And in this case, we're going to assume that he's talking about metabolic rate. So how many calories per day, your total daily energy expenditure, how many calories a day you burn through the 4 mechanisms of calorie burn. So you have the basal metabolic rate, how many calories you burn just doing nothing, just existing. You have the thermic effect of food, how many calories you burn by processing and digesting certain foods. You have your exercise activity thermogenesis, or EAT. That is how many calories per day you burn exercising. And then you have NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And basal metabolic rate is responsible for most of that, I believe around 70%. NEAT is the second most. Exercise and thermic effect of food are responsible for the least. Even though a lot of people think that exercise is a great way to burn calories, it burns a lot of calories and it's the primary thing responsible for how many calories per day you burn. That is not the case. It's actually the least. So just remember that. Obviously, if you're exercising a shit ton, it's responsible for more of your total daily energy expenditure, absolute numbers. But for most people, it's you don't want to rely on that. It's not very sustainable. But either way, can it affect your metabolic rate? Overall, yes, absolutely. It can affect the calories out portion of the equation. So all the things I just mentioned are the calories out. What you eat is the calories in. If you burn more calories than you consume, you're going to lose weight. Vice versa. If you eat the same, give or take, you're going to maintain your weight. And it can affect lots of different parts of that equation. First, we'll talk about NEAT. NEAT, again, is non-exercise activity thermogenesis. That's things like moving around in your seat, fidgeting, scratching your face, getting up, sitting down, just daily movements that are not necessarily intentional exercise, but they're still moving and you still burn calories. People debate whether walking could be considered NEAT or not. Usually walking is technically exercise, but a lot of people consider it NEAT, but that's kind of semantics. Doesn't matter all that much. But having low T will often result in low motivation. It will result in low energy. It will result, and this is not always, when I say it will result, in a lot of people, this is how it presents. So some people do have low testosterone and they have no idea. They don't have any symptoms of it. Other people have what would be considered normal testosterone and it's not crazy low, but they have symptoms of low testosterone and therefore they could benefit from bringing their testosterone up, whether through lifestyle means or through getting on TRT, etc. But either way, when I say it will do this, I am not saying in everyone, if you have low testosterone, you're automatically going to feel this. Just getting that out of the way. But low motivation, low drive, low energy, probably less likely to want to get up and be super active, and probably less likely to do things that otherwise would require a bunch of energy, or you may just not be motivated to like go out on walks. You may not be motivated to move around your house. You may not be motivated to be active. You might just feel more like sitting still and doing really not all that much when you have low testosterone. And that will absolutely affect how many calories you burn throughout the day through NEAT. Additionally, it can affect your basal metabolic rate. A lot of times when your testosterone is low, your cortisol, which is a stress hormone, which is a very important hormone that I've talked about ad nauseum pretty much, but you can have cortisol that is higher than it's supposed to be, or higher at the wrong times of the day, or just excessively high. And cortisol is a catabolic hormone. So although it's very important to have cortisol, it is part of the stress response, and you want it to be optimal. You don't want it to be crazy high, because what often happens is it lowers your metabolic rate. It lowers your basal metabolic rate. So you don't burn as many calories, just your basal metabolic rate is lower. Cortisol also is, like I said, catabolic. So when your cortisol is super high all the time, you're not recovering from your training very well, because you're just always kind of in a stressed out state, whether you feel it or not. If your cortisol is high, that's just a high stress hormone. Your body is in a more stressed out state. And when you're in a stressed out state, you don't recover from your training, and therefore you're not really as primed to build muscle. And having muscle on your frame is one of the most important things for having a higher resting metabolic rate. So if you're struggling to gain muscle, then that is going to kind of indirectly affect how many calories you burn throughout the day. Even some people will end up losing muscle because not only are they just having a difficult time, even if they do train, building that muscle, they're also having a difficult time finding the motivation and the energy to go train, and beyond that, go train hard in a way that is going to benefit them and build muscle and continue to build strength, et cetera, et cetera. So that can be kind of an indirect way that low testosterone can kind of decrease your overall daily energy expenditure. Additionally, because you're not really feeling that great, your motivation's kind of low, you probably have these habits that have led to this low testosterone. Not in every single case, but in many cases, people self-induce their lower testosterone. And oftentimes that is coupled with not great eating habits. So that could potentially change the calories in portion of the equation. You may be tempted to eat shittier food that takes less effort to make, that's more convenient, that's more processed, that's more palatable, and less nutritious and less satiating, and therefore you eat more of it. So therefore it doesn't necessarily have a direct effect on your metabolic rate, but it will affect how many calories you can eat and not gain weight. So lots of other things. There's lots of other factors. Those are some main ones. But yes, absolutely. If your testosterone is low, especially if your free testosterone is low and you have some low testosterone, getting that fixed, whether it's by lifestyle means or whether it is by going and seeing a professional, an endocrinologist, or someone that is qualified in this area in hormone health to try and get your testosterone back up, whether it's through a supplement like enclomiphene or HCG, or whether you just straight up go on TRT. That wouldn't be my first option. I wouldn't recommend that as your first step, but in some cases it may be necessary for a lot of people. And it can be very life-changing for a lot of people, because having low testosterone, metabolic rate aside, calorie burn aside, having low testosterone is not good. You are way better off having high normal testosterone through exogenous means like taking TRT injections than you are just living your life with low testosterone. It's not good for health. It's not good for overall well-being. And it would be a good idea to try and do the things that are necessary to bring it up. Try those. Sleep better, manage your stress better, train hard, eat better foods, lose body fat, et cetera, et cetera. I made a post recently about some of the highest leverage, lowest hanging fruit ways to improve your testosterone or bring up your testosterone naturally. I'll link to that in the show notes. But yeah, definitely not a great situation to be in, but there is hope. There are lots of options to bring it up. Sometimes it just takes a lot of effort. Sometimes it takes a little bit of pharmacological help, but it is definitely worth considering and not just kind of grinding through life with low testosterone. Next question, do you listen to music / podcasts while running, or do you raw dog it? I love that raw dog is becoming a new word in a lot of these questions. If you're not familiar, a couple episodes ago, we talked about raw dogging, going to the gym without using headphones or bringing your phone and things like that, and why it's probably an underrated thing. But either way, for me, it's probably about a 50-50 split. For most longer, slower runs, I would say probably 75% of those ones, I bring my phone and headphones and I listen to either a podcast or an audiobook. For whatever reason, I do like listening to music when I lift, but I'm no longer a fan of music when I run. It's just so much time that I could spend learning instead of just listening to music, and therefore I opt for it. If I'm listening to a podcast or a book while lifting, I just don't focus on it enough. So it's kind of just not really worth it. So I'll listen to music when I'm lifting, but when I'm doing like an easy zone 2 run, it's easy for me to actually listen and pay attention to what I'm listening to. So therefore I listen to a book or a podcast. When I'm doing faster stuff, threshold work, speed work, sprints, anything like that, no, I don't bring it. I like to be present with that, focused on it, and also having my phone in my little fanny pack thing when I'm going faster. It just kind of like bounces up and down and it's really annoying. So I leave that stuff at home when I do faster stuff. So I would say, again, 3/4 of my runs, my longer runs, I'll probably listen to something. I will say going on long runs without anything is also great, because that's why I make sure to do it at least sometimes, usually 1 run per week minimum. I'll go for a long run without anything. And then every single day, no matter what, I always do 1 walk where I don't bring anything, because I have some of my best ideas on runs and walks without listening to anything. It just allows me to, my subconscious mind, to formulate thoughts. And I've had some of my best ideas doing that. So I always make sure that I don't do it for every single run. Usually I don't come up with great ideas when I'm kind of suffering through a speed workout session or a threshold session, but on long runs, that is a great time to formulate ideas and just kind of, even if you're not working something that involves creativity, just being alone with your thoughts and away from your phone for a little while, I talked about this a couple episodes ago, is a really good thing in today's day and age, because everyone is just always connected, and it is really not good for your mental health to be just permanently connected to the internet, social media, etc. So that's the way I do it. That's the way I recommend doing it. Honestly, if you're training for something specific and like you really want to focus on your performance, I would go raw dog for all of your runs, at least the vast majority of them, because you have to just kind of get used to being in tune with your body and knowing what certain paces feel like. And you also want to get used to just kind of allowing yourself to be a little more bored, and it's totally fine. Like, you're going to be okay if you don't listen to anything, you don't have something to distract you. And that's just kind of in general going through life, making an effort to allow yourself to be bored periodically is a really good life skill. So it would be something I recommend for pretty much everybody. Next question, thoughts on fitness variables, viability of tracking biometrics. What would you recommend? Yeah, so this is a kind of a loaded question, maybe something I'll do a full episode on at some point, but I'll kind of talk about the basics, because there's so many different types of fitness wearables. You've got Whoops, you've got Oura rings, you've got smartwatches, et cetera, and there definitely is a decent amount of value in certain wearables. So I'll kind of split these into 2 categories. We'll talk about like running watches, or watches that you use to track your fitness, and then I'll talk about sleep tracking. So running watches, Garmin's, Coros watches, whatever you have, Apple watches. I don't know how people continue to use Apple watches for runs, because you have to charge them every single day, which I think is insane. My Garmin Fenix 7S, depending on how much I use it, usually I charge it every Sunday, and it charges in 30 minutes and it's good for the next week. And it's usually got anywhere between 15 and 30% battery when I charge it on Sunday. So it would last even longer. And that's using the GPS. I don't use it a ton. I mean, I average 20 to 25 miles usually of running per week, and I don't put the GPS on really any other time. But anyway, it lasts a long time. So if you want to use Apple Watch, great, but I don't know how people handle charging it every single day, because that's kind of annoying. But any of those watches are great for running. If you're interested in running or cardio, any sort of conditioning where you are measuring your pace, you're measuring your distance, you're measuring your heart rate, things like that. Although I would absolutely not rely on a wrist-worn device for heart rate. It can be somewhat accurate depending on what you have and how tight you put it and the intensity. If you're going lower intensity, it's usually a little bit more accurate. But for true heart rate, another wearable would be a heart rate strap, and I would recommend wearing that. That can be a great use case for them, and I have nothing wrong with people using them. However, and this is the case with all wearables, it is important to also be in tune with your body and not get too obsessed with always checking your pace, always checking your heart rate, always checking how long you've gone. I call it watch obsession, and it is absolutely a problem in a lot of people. They're always just checking their watch, and it's important to kind of break away from that a little bit and just be in tune with how your body feels. Like, you should be able to guess after running for a little while and establishing your routine and being mindful on your runs at different paces with different intents for the training session. You should be able to feel approximately whether you're going the right intensity or not. And if you're always just relying on your watch to tell you that, yeah, I guess it can work. But at the same time, it's a way to add stress into the training session. And if you're always checking your watch, your heart rate is probably going to be on average a little bit higher than it would be if you just kind of went and enjoyed yourself. And then maybe every so often you check your watch. So can be great for data, but also don't become data obsessed. Just be data aware is the best way that I would probably put that. How accurate is it for GPS and for pace and things like that? It's definitely as accurate as you need it. You don't need to be, crazy down to the exact foot accurate. It's good enough. For heart rate, like I said, I would wear a heart rate strap if you really care about heart rate. I've talked about this millions of times, but you don't necessarily have to track heart rate. Just kind of depends on your goal and what you're going for. But sleep wearables can also be a good tool for certain people in certain contexts. If you have never paid attention to your sleep before, wearing a sleep wearable would be a great idea for a period of time, because it'll actually give you a decently accurate, at least for trends, depiction of what you're doing at night, what your sleep looks like. Is it super duper accurate? Is it perfect? No, but it absolutely can show trends. And these things are usually pretty consistent. Even if they're not perfectly accurate, they're usually pretty consistent. And you can also, the best way to use these is to learn what you're doing at nighttime and how certain habits that you do throughout the day affect your sleep, things like that. It's almost like if you've never tracked calories before, going through a period of time where you track calories can be eye-opening, because it actually gives you data to go by and not just going by feel and thinking, yeah, I sleep decent. Yeah, I eat a decent amount of food. This is actually hard data, and it can teach you a lot. But like tracking calories, sometimes it can be taken too far, or it can be over-obsessed about, or you can just do it for so long that it just adds stress to your life. And I don't think going through life, for some people, this is totally fine. And they actually prefer tracking everything they eat and tracking their sleep and being very diligent with it. And it doesn't cause problems like over obsession, or in some cases, believe it or not, actually, this is not all that uncommon for like sleep wearables. People will be so stressed about their sleep score that it negatively affects their sleep. They'll be going to bed thinking, I want to get the best sleep score. They'll be worried so much about not getting a good sleep score that it actually adds stress and affects their sleep negatively. And they would sleep better without using that. If that's you and you still want to continue to wear them, because that's been me in the past, believe it or not, I don't wear a sleep wearable now. My mattress topper, the 8 Sleep, tracks my sleep. I don't know how accurate or perfect it is, but it does. And my Garmin watch also tracks my sleep. There is definitely some discrepancy between the two. But either way, I used to be super duper obsessed with that stuff. And I used to let it psych me out. I would check my sleep score in the morning. And if it was bad, it would ruin my day. I'd be like, fuck, I can't do anything that I wanted to do today because I had a bad night of sleep. Now, I am not like that necessarily anymore. I look at it very objectively, and I don't attach emotion to it or anything like that. I don't let it affect my day. But I have in the past. And if you do end up thinking that it is potentially going to negatively affect you, then what I recommend doing is either looking at your scores later in the day after you've done everything. So maybe at like 6 p.m. you can look at your score, or you could also just have your spouse or your friend or something like that look at the scores for you, maybe write it down, and then like the end of the week you could check it out. Or you could look back in your app at the end of the week and check it out and see, what nights you slept well, which nights you didn't. And then also another useful thing that you can potentially do is give yourself a little questionnaire, a subjective questionnaire. What do I think my sleep score was? How do I feel? Do I feel well rested? Do I feel motivated? Do I feel like I'm easily able to focus? Things like that. That way, you're not just going off the data. You're also being in tune with your body, and you're knowing how you feel. Because believe it or not, these things are relatively new, and people were performing at crazy high levels before we ever had a wearable, because your body will give you pretty damn good feedback if you're in tune with it and you're honest with yourself about how well rested, how well recovered you are, and how primed to perform you are. Sometimes it will be very, very much similar with how you feel subjectively as well as the data. Sometimes it won't be, though. Sometimes your data will tell you you slept terrible and you are not recovered, but you feel amazing, and vice versa. For example, if you wake up, you feel amazing, you're super pumped to go work out, and you look at your data and you're in the red on the Whoop, or it tells you you got a really bad night of sleep and you're not recovered, or your HRV is super duper low. Oftentimes that can mess with people and be like, why do I feel so good? I still should dial it back today because my wearable is telling me to do that. And I think that's a huge mistake. So being aware of it, being data aware, not data obsessed, is a good thing, but it really just depends on what you're going for, what type of person you are. If you like data, or if you don't like data, you're more intuitive. I personally am a little bit more intuitive these days than just going off data. It kind of messes with me if I allow too much data to come into my life, whether it's for wearables or other things, work, stuff like that too. So I like to be a little bit more intuitive and go with kind of how my body feels and what my body's telling me to do. But it really just depends on the person, your personality, and what you're going for. But hopefully that kind of gives you a good overview. Definitely not super comprehensive, but that's kind of my overall thoughts on that. Next question, how long does it take for fitness adaptations to go away? Cardio versus strength. All right, so what I think he means is how long does it take to start losing them? Because how long it takes to go away completely, like lose all of your gains, is months and months. You'd have to not train at all for these two types of adaptations. It depends on lots of different factors, but probably 3, 4, 5 months for them to pretty much go back to baseline. For them to start decreasing, for you to start seeing performance decrements and adaptations slowly fading away. For conditioning, we'll talk conditioning first, cardio. After approximately 10 days or so, probably after a week, you'll start seeing really, really tiny, almost immeasurable decrements in your conditioning ability. 10 to 14 days or so, you might see a little bit more measurable. 3 to 4 weeks is when you really start seeing increased resting heart rate. Your VO2 max and some other metrics like that might start decreasing. If you take 3 weeks off completely from running, you go out for a run, you're probably not going to feel great. You're going to get tired pretty quickly, because there's also a skill component. It depends on what type of conditioning you're doing, but all conditioning has a skill component, especially more technical things like running. Yes, running is one of the most technical types of conditioning you can do. Seems really simple. Lots of people do it. But if you go to a running trail and just sit and observe, you will notice that not a lot of people have great running mechanics, which is why one of the reasons a lot of people get hurt running. But either way, there is a skill component for that. So it'll feel a little bit foreign and novel to you. But the good thing is, even if you take 2 weeks off, even if that first run back is not your best performance, after a few days of consistent running again, you'll be back to normal. In fact, for a lot of people that are listening to this, you take 2 weeks off, maybe the first couple sessions aren't great, but after that, you're going to be better than you were, because a lot of people just train so much that they need a couple weeks off sometimes, and allowing that fatigue and inflammation and mental stress to go away by taking a little bit of time off. I'm not saying you have to take 2 weeks off, but just an example. Oftentimes that's just what you needed, and you go back into running. You're more motivated. You are less inflamed. You are well recovered. You're less stressed out. You start making better gains. You kind of break through whatever plateau you may have been in before. That's kind of the reason for doing like a taper. Tapers are not completely like 2 weeks completely off, but they're a reduction in volume. They're a reduction usually in intensity, and you allow your body to kind of recover and hopefully super compensate. So you're below baseline, you take your taper and you super compensate, which means now you're above, you have a new baseline and you're significantly faster, and hopefully you perform significantly better. But that would be it for conditioning. For strength, it's very similar. Strength has a neurological component, aka a skill component. So you can lose strength in a specific movement, but not necessarily strength in general. Like the muscles aren't smaller and weaker, but say, for example, you don't do back squats for 3 months, but you do train your legs with some other form of squat. When you go back to the back squat after 3 months, you're going to be weaker in the back squat in particular than you were before, just because it's a little bit novel to you again. It's decently novel to you again because that exact movement wasn't trained. For example, my legs right now are way stronger than they were when I was back squatting 450 pounds. But I am not capable of back squatting 450 pounds right now because I haven't back squatted in like a year and a half. So that's kind of an example of like the neurological and skill component of it. But if you take a couple weeks off from lifting, you will be weaker in your first workout back, most likely, unless you really, really overdid it going into those 2 weeks and you really needed time off. Then you might be stronger because you just recovered and all those things I talked about with the conditioning thing. But it'll come back super quickly and you should be back to baseline after a few workouts, after kind of getting that skill component back. As for like muscle loss, you would have to take most likely 2 to 3 weeks off to lose any muscle, and it would be very difficult to detect. You might go back to the gym and feel a little bit weaker. Oftentimes when you don't lift for a while, your diet will change a little bit too. And just the fact that you're not lifting will reduce how muscular you look. You'll have less glycogen in your muscles, and also you'll have less inflammation and things like that. Oftentimes the reason people look more jacked that like the day after they lift or something like that isn't because they gained a bunch of muscle yesterday. It's because they just have inflammation from that training session, which isn't a bad thing. It's part of the recovery and adaptation process, but it is kind of a thing. A lot of people will actually be like, yeah, I lifted hard yesterday, and for whatever reason, I woke up like 3 pounds heavier today. Some of that may be salt, sodium, carbohydrate intake, water intake, things like that. But also it could be some inflammation from the day before. That's just totally normal. It's part of life. But yeah, you're not going to really lose gains very quickly. You can take a couple weeks off and be totally fine. A lot of people intentionally take 10 days off per year just to reset. And even if you're weaker going into the workouts right afterwards, you're going to end up getting back to where you were very, very quickly after a couple of training sessions. If you take a couple of months off, yeah, you're going to lose some strength, but also that strength comes back quickly. Strength that you've had before and muscle mass that you've had before comes back a lot faster than newly gained muscle and newly gained strength that you've never had access to before. So, for example, if you used to be crazy jacked, you take 5 years off from training and you think, shit, it's good. Say it took you 15 years to get as jacked as you got that first time. You think it's going to take you 15 years again? No, absolutely not. It might take you a year or sometimes even less. It really depends on the person and the circumstances, but it comes back a lot quicker than it initially gets gained. And these things are really easy to maintain. What it takes to get to a certain level of fitness, this is both conditioning and lifting, a little bit different, but pretty similar. It's way easier to maintain them. So you can literally, with strength, you can drop your volume down by like 1/5, 1/7, and maintain most, if not all of your strength and your muscle. And with conditioning, you can't quite drop it down 1/7, but you absolutely can drop it quite a bit and maintain most of it. So not exactly a perfect black and white answer. Tons and tons of different factors come in. What you're doing during your time off. Are you at SEER school, just not eating and getting beat up? Or are you taking a 10-day vacation or something like that where you're just kind of chilling out? Or are you taking a 10-day vacation where you're just getting hammered and eating shitty food? Then it's going to be a little bit more problematic. But yeah, kind of depends. Power and speed, top end power and speed. Not that this was asked, but that is the fastest adaptation to decrease, which is why I recommend at least once per week doing some sort of jumps, sprints, throws, etc. That will maintain your top end power speed ability if you care about that attribute. But I absolutely would care about it. Doing at least something that develops your super fast twitch muscle fibers. The muscle fibers that are involved in sprinting, jumping, and very fast, powerful movements. Again, those go away very quickly. They go away with age, and they go away if you don't combat them and train them. And it really doesn't take much. You could do 3 sets of jumps twice a week and be totally good to go. As long as you switch the jumps up every so often. You could even do medicine ball throws. Of course, you can do Olympic lifts and things like that if you have the ability to do them. But for most people, it's literally, hey, do 3 sets of 3 box jumps on Monday and 3 sets of medicine ball squat tosses on Thursday, and you're good to go. You're going to maintain it. You're not going to build a ton of power from that, but you're going to maintain it. And most people go 5 years without training that stuff. So if you haven't been training any sort of jumps, throws, or anything like that, I would highly suggest at least implementing it into 1 or 2 workouts per week. Again, it does not have to take long. I usually do it before I lift as a way to ramp up my nervous system, as well as just maintain that fast twitch ability, and good to go. So hopefully that makes sense. a lot of people get super nervous about taking time off and they think they're going to lose everything. And that's just not the way it works, especially if you do a little bit. If you just completely stop training for a while, yeah, you're going to lose some, but it's going to come back fast either way, and not something to worry too much about. Next question, is it better to have a consistent sleep schedule or to sleep in when and where you can? So in a perfect world, the former would be leaps and bounds better than the latter, as long as you are getting enough sufficient sleep. So for example, if you have a pretty predictable schedule and you don't have a lot of obligations and you pretty much can choose when you go to bed and when you wake up, and you decide to go to bed within the same 30 minutes and wake up within the same 30 minutes every single day or almost every single day, you are going to be way, 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 way better off than if you decide to go to bed at sporadic times and wake up at sporadic times, but you're still trying to get 8 hours, if that makes sense. So even if you got 7 hours of sleep and you did that first thing, as opposed to just trying to get 8 hours, but it's always at a different time, that 7 hours of sleep is going to be way higher quality than the 8 hours you try to get when you're just going to bed at random times, waking up at random times. So if you have the ability to, you don't have obligations, work obligations, family obligations, anything like that, absolutely, that would be the number one sleep habit, hands down, to develop, is to go to bed and wake up at the same time. You want to, of course, ensure that it's enough sleep, it's sufficient sleep. You know, if you're doing that, but it's only 4 hours of sleep every single night, yeah, that's probably going to be a problem. But if it's a reasonable amount, 6 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours, everyone's a little bit different with how much sleep they need to optimize, then you're going to be much better off. As for should you sleep in when you can take it? If you have to, absolutely. If that's the only thing that's going to get you sufficient sleep to function and get by, for example, if you sometimes work late, if you have a baby at home or something like that, you have to get up and you don't really have control of your schedule 100%, then yes, there are absolutely times where making up for poor sleep is a good idea, or insufficient sleep is a good idea. The problem with this, obviously, is that it's not very conducive to your circadian rhythm. By moving your bed and wake up time around, you're not going to be able to get as much quality sleep. Your sleep is going to be far less quality than it would be if it was the same time every day and every morning. So with that being said, you know, if you a couple nights a week have to sleep in a little bit because you have to stay up late, you're probably better off doing that than just waking up no matter what. If it's one night every so often, if you're doing the first thing I talked about and you're very consistent with your sleep and wake times, and occasionally maybe you go out and you go to bed a little bit later than you otherwise would, than you normally would, then I recommend that next morning still getting up at the same time. Even though that day is going to kind of suck, it's going to throw you off less in subsequent days. So for example, if you usually go to bed like I do at 8 p.m. and you go out with friends and you don't go to bed till 10 o'clock that night, and you usually get up at 4 a.m. like I do, and you decide to sleep till 5:30, 6 o'clock just to get that 8 hours, well, that next night is going to throw you off a little bit. You're going to have trouble sleeping that next night, and potentially so on and so forth. Whereas if you just get up at the same time and suck it up that day, you're going to be tired at your normal bedtime, maybe even a little earlier, go to bed a little early, and you're just going to be much better off in future days. So no perfect answer for it, but a lot of people are in the situation where they can control when they go to bed almost every single night, and they still just decide not to, and they're literally giving themselves jet lag all the time. If you go to bed at the same time and wake up at the same time throughout the week, and then on weekends you go to bed 3 hours later and you sleep in 3 hours, Saturday, Sunday, you're going to have a terrible night of sleep on Sunday night going into the next week, and it's going to take you a few days to recalibrate. So pretty much what you're doing by doing that is flying to California. You're flying from the East Coast to California. And most people have probably experienced changing time zones, and you don't feel great for the first couple of days. Well, that's literally what you're doing, except you're just self-inducing it every weekend. And a lot of people are like that every weekend. There's literally a name for it, the case of the Mondays. And most people self-induce the case of the Mondays. You add drinking and alcohol to that, and that's just a recipe for disastrous sleep and poor recovery and not feeling great for a few days every single week. That could easily be rectified by you just making better decisions and being more disciplined for a bit until it becomes a habit. Then the great thing is when you exercise some discipline to get your sleep and wake times consistent, yeah, it's hard at first because you're not used to it, but then you feel how amazing it feels, and you feel infinitely better every single day. And then you don't even want to go back to staying up late. Anytime I have to stay up later than I want to, I get a little bit of anxiety because I really don't want it to throw me off for a couple of days. Some situations are absolutely worth it. I think that anything with family, friends, so long as it's not every single night, if you are socializing and building relationships and things like that, then it's totally worth doing sometimes. If you are grinding at work, you have maybe like a deadline to hit and you prefer working in the evening, you just work better in the evening and you stay up late once in a while, not a huge deal. That's understandable. But if you're just deciding to scroll on Instagram or watch 7 Netflix shows consecutively instead of go to bed, then that's probably something to consider changing if you care about recovery and feeling better and being more productive throughout the day and just overall well-being and living longer. So hopefully that helps kind of drive that home. But yeah, good question. Next question. How would you program farmer's carries, overhead carries, and shoulder carries into a routine? Yeah, there's a lot of options for this. You can shoulder carries. I think he means like carrying a sandbag or an odd object, D-ball, something like that on your shoulders, which is great thing to do. You can do this in lots of different ways. You can do it as part of your warm-up. You can do it at the end of a session, finish off with some carries. You can do it as part of a strongman circuit or something like that, where you do maybe some sled work, maybe some farmer's carries, maybe some overhead carries, maybe some sandbag get-ups or something like that, and just kind of go continuously at like a 6, 7, 8 RPE. That's also a great way to do it. That's what I have a lot of my guys do. But for the most part, I program carries to finish off training sessions. You can do it on upper body day. You can do it on a lower body day. The thing is that people kind of sometimes forget is that carries still add fatigue. And if you go really, really heavy with the carries, you're absolutely fatiguing yourself neurologically overall. It's going to potentially interfere with other types of training. That doesn't mean you can't do heavy carries. It just means you have to consider that in the context of your entire week of training. So if you're just going like max balls to the wall, super heavy carries, or if you're going lighter, but you're just going all the way till grip failure all the time, it's going to absolutely interfere, or it's going to affect. It potentially could interfere, but it's at least going to have some sort of effect on your other training, your overall recovery, and your overall readiness to train. So for the most part, I recommend going relatively moderate load and going not until you're completely at grip failure for the most part. Occasionally throwing in some super heavy carries in, occasionally even strapping up. That way you're not really fatiguing your grip, and you grab super heavy kettlebells, dumbbells, whatever you're carrying, hex bar, and using straps that can build, like your upper back. It's not like a super crazy hypertrophy movement because it's mostly isometric. But if you do really heavy carries once in a while with straps, it's not going to be detrimental. It absolutely can help you build sort of, I hate this word, but functional strength, the ability to carry things, heavy things for a longer period of time, even if you're using straps. If you're not using straps, no big deal. You're just not going to be able to go as heavy, and therefore it's going to be more of a grip stimulus than upper back traps and just overall full body. So for overhead carries, I actually really like overhead carries. I think more people should do overhead carries because a lot of people will notice if they try them that they don't have very good overhead mobility or stability. So I personally do overhead carries on upper body days as part of my warm up. Usually on upper body days, I go to the gym and I start with calf raises. I hit calves on upper body days, not lower body days. Once in a while, lower body days too. But I hit calves upper body at the beginning of the workout. I do some push-ups. I do maybe some dead hangs to kind of warm up before I get into my main pressing and pulling movements. And also I'll do some overhead carries with a relatively light kettlebell. And that just kind of helps stabilize the shoulder, kind of turn those muscles on. Not that they're turned off, but that's just, understandable word for it. Get those small intrinsic muscles and your soft tissue ready for your upcoming training session. So I like doing that as well. And then usually for farmer's carries, you can absolutely do farmer's carries, suitcase carries as part of your warm up, so long as you're not just completely smashing yourself. But there's lots of different options. The main things you want to focus on is not going crazy heavy. So like your posture is breaking down. You want to be able to walk with like really good posture. I usually have guys walk slowly and under control. Sometimes I have guys take 10 steps, stop, take 10 steps, stop, so they can get used to starting and stopping while carrying things. It really just depends on what you're going for. But As for over the shoulder carries, same thing. You can kind of throw those in wherever you want. You can put them as part of a strongman session, or you can put them in your warm up or your cool down, whatever it may be. So not necessarily a cool down, but just a finisher or something like that. So not super complicated. You don't have to do tons and tons of carries. You can do, even if you're training for selection and you do carries twice per week, you're going to be totally fine. You don't have to do carries every single day. A lot of people have this misconception. This wasn't the question, but I do want to cover it. A lot of people have this misconception where they can get their grip strong enough to where they're never going to hit grip failure at selection. And eventually you're going to hit grip failure. Even if the world's strongest man went to selection, he would eventually hit grip failure. Most likely. Maybe not, but probably. World's strongest man's 350 pounds and he wouldn't make it to team week. So if that's any consolation, but eventually you're going to hit grip failure. You don't want to be the weakest guy on your team. You don't want to be the one that is always dropping things before anyone else. But at the same time, taking grip training too far, like going out on a 7-mile ruck every single week and carrying kettlebells with you and just destroying yourself is not necessary. So just be reasonable with it. Definitely focus mostly on moderate load endurance rather than going heavy and not going very far, and just be consistent with it. Progress. You can progress by going longer or adding weight slowly over time or slowing down and kind of go from there. Next question, what running shoes are you using these days? Easy work versus tempo work? Yeah, so I usually don't really discriminate between wearing certain shoes for easy work versus tempo work versus speed work. I usually just wear whatever I think is going to feel the best that day. I have a pair of Brooks Mach 6s. No, Brooks Glycerin 21s and Hoka Mach 6s. And I just rotate back and forth between those. If I was going to do a max time trial, something like that, then I would wear the Mach 6s. They're just a little bit lighter and they feel a little bit more springy. And the Glycerin 21s are more of a all-around shoe that are decent for pretty much everything, but they're not super duper speed shoes. But aside from that, I just kind of wear either one, and I like both of them. The Hokas might need to be upgraded here soon. They've got a lot of miles on them. I'm not sure exactly how many. I don't necessarily track that. I should, but I don't. Usually for most people, every 400-ish miles, maybe if you're bigger and more beefy, maybe even more often than that. Or if you have running form that is very suggestive that you hate the ground, AKA you just smash the ground and you overstride, you might need to switch your running shoes out. I mean, I would get that figured out and improve your running form, reduce your cadence, etc. But you might need to switch shoes out a little bit more often. Usually it's 300 to 500 miles, but also most of that recommendation is geared towards runners, and most runners are not 250 pounds. So just something to consider. But I usually switch mine out, give or take, every 400-ish miles. But again, I have not necessarily been tracking. So I usually just look at the treads, or I have a desire to get a dopamine hit and I'll get new running shoes, but don't have to overthink it. Just because I use those shoes as well does not mean those are the best shoes for you either. Everyone's got different feet. Everyone's got a different gait. Everyone has different goals, mileage, surfaces they run on, things like that. So the best option would be to go to a professional, have them do a quick gait analysis, find a good brand, ideally find a good shoe, but also if one brand has one shoe that you enjoy, sometimes that brand will also have other shoes that work well for you. You can definitely experiment and go with different shoes as you progress throughout your running career. But usually if you find something that sticks, just stick to it. Just get the upgraded version of it. You know, do you like the Brooks Glycerin? I think they go up by 2 every time. So get the Glycerin 23s next time they come out, and then the 25s and the 27s, etc. Again, you can jump around, not a huge deal, especially if you're a proficient runner and your shoes are not like kind of saving you from running injuries, which would be a good goal to get to that place. But oftentimes, if you're really looking to continue to run without getting hurt and you find something that works, I would just stick with it and upgrade every so often, every time you hit 400-ish miles, and you're going to be good to go. Next question, is running on a treadmill often beneficial? Yes, absolutely. Not more beneficial necessarily than running outside, but also not less beneficial. It really just depends on the context and the scenario. If you are training for running that's going to take place outside and you're not a very, very advanced runner that's spent years and years and years running outside, and you have found that running on a treadmill doesn't decrease from your performance, then you absolutely can run on a treadmill or you can run outside. It's really up to you. If you prefer the treadmill, go for it. If you are less of a high level runner, less experienced runner, and you're training for something that's going to occur outside, whether it's a 2-mile run, 5-mile run, or selection or something like that, or a race, you definitely want to get a good chunk of your running in outside, ideally on similar surfaces in similar terrain, rolling hills, whatever it may be. However, there are absolutely cases where running on a treadmill makes sense. If you're doing a speed session, for example, if you're doing repeats or a threshold run and it's crazy, crazy hot outside, or it's crazy, crazy cold outside, or there's snow and ice on the ground, or it's a thunderstorm or something like that. Nothing wrong whatsoever with running on a treadmill. Absolutely no problem. Actually, I would recommend that. You're going to get better speed adaptations if you do it in a climate controlled environment, or if it's the winter time and there's ice and snow, you're not going to get a great tempo run in, and it's potentially going to be dangerous to do it outside. A lot of people are kind of purists about, oh, you better do all of your training outside. Treadmills are cheating or something like that, which is not true at all. That's just a very closed-minded approach. That's kind of like the running version of the people who think like using straps for lifting and belts for lifting is not okay ever in any context, which is completely just indicates that you have no idea what you're talking about. Or if you live in an area that's very, very hilly and you want to do tempo work or threshold work or speed work or something like that. I'm not talking like little rolling hills. I'm talking like very, very hilly. Like sometimes you might be going up a 30% incline. 30 is pretty steep. Sometimes you might be going up a 15% incline, 16% incline. Other times you might be going down that 16% incline. When you're doing tempo work, threshold work, that's going to significantly affect the adaptations that you might get from that run. Now, if you're training for a run that you know is going to take place in similar terrain, that's one thing. But if you're training for a run that's going to take place on reasonable terrain, maybe some rolling hills, mostly flat, even a little bit of potential slightly steep hills, but not really, then you want to probably not do most of that training outside on the really, really hilly terrain, because going uphill is going to slow you down and it's going to reduce your potential adaptations to that tempo pace, because you're just going to have to slow down or else you're going to go way, way too hard for a tempo run. And then going downhill is also, it's going to make you faster for sure, but it's also going to be a little bit rough on the joints. Running fast downhill, of course, when you have to do it is great. If you're training for something that's going to take place, running fast downhill, you want to get used to it. But if you're not, it's just going to add stress to your joints. And it's not necessarily what I would recommend doing all the time. So in that case, I would use a treadmill, put it on 1%, maybe rotate back and forth between 0%, 1%, 3%, something like that, and stick to your tempo pace. Or if you don't have access to a track, if you have no access to a track and you don't have any access to like flat ground anywhere and you want to do speed work, boom, treadmill would be perfect. Or if you live in a very, very flat area and you're training for something that's going to take place on hills, then you could do the opposite. You could do your tempo work with a little bit of hills on the treadmill, with the incline on the treadmill. You can also do hill sprints, hill repeats on a treadmill. Doing hill repeats on a treadmill can, in some cases, be even more optimal than doing it outside. It depends on what you have access to. But if you don't have any great hills around, or if you want to really be in control of your rest periods, where you just hop off the treadmill, hop back on, instead of finishing the hill and having to walk all the way back down to the bottom, then treadmills can be great. So lots and lots of potential benefits to running on the treadmill. But also just remember that if you're only doing treadmill running, it's going to be a little bit different when you get outside and do outdoor running, especially if you are training for something that's going to take place outdoors. So if you live in an area that is conducive to all outdoor running, I think it's way more mentally stimulating and more enjoyable to run outside, then absolutely do it. But if any of the things I just mentioned apply to you, or sometimes apply to you, depending on the season or whatever, or where you're at throughout the year, then thinking that the treadmill is going to be some sort of bad option that you need to avoid is a mistake. You absolutely can do more stuff on treadmills. Next question, tips for a 21-day non-select going back. All right, so for those not aware, that is a 21-day non-select is when you go to selection, you make it all the way through to the end, but for whatever reason, you don't walk away with a selected stamp. And it can be pretty rough. But at the same time, you are definitely going back with a massive advantage because A, you know you can make it through the entire thing. And that's not something a lot of people can say. So you made it through, you just didn't perform quite as well as you needed to make it in whatever it may be. So that should give you a big boost of confidence. That, and you've already seen it all. So you've already been exposed to what it's going to look like. It's not going to be all that different, if any different, when you go back. It might be a different time of year, so it might be slightly different weather-wise and vegetation-wise, but for the most part, you've seen it all. You've been exposed to it all. And so you have a good idea of what you're getting into, and certain things that are very challenging for you, certain things that you do really well on, et cetera, et cetera. Additionally, what you should focus on would be the things that they told you that you were weaker at, that you should work more on. So if you are a 21-day non-select, unless something has changed, they're going to give you an out brief where they tell you why you didn't make it. Some of the things that maybe you fell short on meeting the standards, and what to work on in the period of time between when you finish and when you go back the second time. So that is what I would mainly focus on. If they told you to get stronger, I would go and lift weights and gain strength. If they told you you need to get faster under a ruck or running, that's what you should work most on. But additionally, you want to make sure the things that you did well the first time don't become weaknesses. So for example, if they told you get much stronger, you're not strong enough, maybe you struggled a lot during team week or something like that, and it was pretty clear that you just hadn't built enough strength to go to selection and be successful. A mistake would be to only lift weights and only get strong and only jacked, and potentially lose a lot of your endurance ability and your rucking ability. So you want to at least maintain the things that you're good at very least, potentially even get better at them, but you want to focus mostly on whatever they told you was the reason that you didn't make it the first time. Maybe it was a character thing. Maybe you have to work on building character. Maybe you have to build more mental toughness. You have to challenge yourself in your day-to-day life more. You have to start being more accountable to yourself. Maybe put yourself in situations where you're super uncomfortable, social situations or something like that. You have to build better habits in your life and not be so dopamine driven, and be more okay with delayed gratification and things like that are very difficult to do these days. They definitely take a lot of work because we live in a world that it's really, really easy to go through life without challenging yourself. You can get food delivered to you immediately. You can get a quick dopamine hit. You can just open your phone and you get a dopamine hit by going on social media, whatever it may be. You compare yourself to others and it just kind of messes up your mental health and multiple different things like that. So definitely focus on bringing up your weaknesses, definitely maintain your strengths, and know when you go back that you're at a massive advantage because you've been there, you've made it through the entire thing. You should have a lot of confidence that you can make it through again. This time, you're just going to have to perform a little bit better at whatever got you the first time, and you should be good to go. It is a great experience to go to selection, not something that most people want to go through twice, but at the same time, lots of people do, and a lot of people are very successful the second time, which makes sense because of pretty much everything I just said. But statistically, people who go through the second time have a much higher chance of making it than just in general people going through the first time. So you should be confident, ready to go, crush. And yeah, just make sure you bring those weaknesses up and you'll be good to go. All right, we'll make this the last question. 50 days out from SFAS, what should my run and ruck frequency look like? Typically, I have guys either on 3 runs and 2 rucks per week or 2 runs and 2 rucks per week. Once in a while, occasionally, if someone's for whatever reason really weak at rucking, I'll have them ruck 3 times a week. Not every single week, but some weeks, but usually 2. That is oftentimes because you're going to have to do other training. You're going to have to lift. You probably want to do a little bit of cross training, non-impact stuff. Usually that's a pretty good split. Now, if you have the ability to recover from more frequency than that, more volume than that, totally fine. Some people have been running their entire lives and telling them that they should only run 2 times a week, even though they'd probably be fine if they did that. But telling them to run 2 times per week in preparation for SFAS wouldn't really be all that appropriate. But like for most people, general people who are not super studs at running or super studs in the gym or super studs at rucking, 2 and 2 or 3 and 2 would be a good way to set it up. And then that's not always the only cardio that you're going to be doing, the only conditioning you're going to be doing. You very well may benefit from doing some cross training, some non-impact stuff as well, just to get more aerobic base building, but also not add more impact to your weekly split. But if you're doing a repeat session, a tempo session, or a fartlek session, an easy run, and a couple of rucks per week, or even drop that easy run, or you can just switch off week to week. One weekend you might do a long run, Next weekend, you might do a long ruck and then just kind of swap back and forth. Then you're going to be pretty good. And then for rucking, if you're doing a slightly heavier, slower walking ruck and a harder, more intense, potentially longer ruck that's a little bit lighter, and you're actually working on that rucking speed, you're going to be good to go. You could probably get away with doing 2 faster rucks per week. It really just depends on your durability, your ability to handle volume and intensity. And are you recovering? Are you progressing? Those are the main things you want to ask yourself. But usually if you're getting 3 runs a week and 2 rucks, or occasionally maybe doing 3 rucks per week, occasionally some people are better off doing 1 ruck per week. It really depends on the person, but those are pretty solid frequencies in regards to prepping for selection that would work pretty well for most people. Obviously, you want to identify which things you're weakest at, most weak at, and maybe dedicate a little bit more bandwidth to those things. Like if you are a really good rucker for whatever reason, but you're just not great at running, maybe you need to do a lot more work on running. You probably could do 4 runs a week and 1 ruck or something like that. That might be a good idea. Or vice versa, which is a little less common. If you're a really good runner, but not a great rucker, maybe some weeks you do 2 rucks, maybe some weeks you do 3, maybe some weeks only 1, and then you kind of sprinkle in your running around that. But that would be, generally speaking, the way I would approach it for most people. But there's a lot of nuance and individual variance that goes into it. So definitely focus on your weaknesses the most, maintain your strengths, and yeah, best of luck. 50 days, plenty of time to get better. So yeah, that's it, guys. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be back soon with another episode. Till then, Terminator out.